Foundations in Biblical Hebrew, Lesson 3. Hebrew vowel points. Hebrew vowel points are referred to as nikud. The vowel points were added to the text of the Hebrew Bible around the neighborhood of 700 AD by the Masoretic scribes. As we discussed in a previous lesson, the vowel sounds were always part of the Hebrew language, but they were not part of the written Hebrew. And part of the reason why the vowel sounds were added later is because so many of the Jews had lost the proper pronunciation of the Hebrew language, especially after the time of the Babylonian captivity. After that period, the Hebrew language began to be replaced as the most common language in Israel with the Aramaic language, which was the language that was the most common trade tongue in the Middle Eastern world in that time period, and especially in Babylon. So by the time of the writing of the New Testament, the most common language spoken in Israel would have been Aramaic, and Hebrew would have become much more of a formal language used by the priests and others. It's very similar to what happened later with the Latin language, which at one point was one of the most common languages, but later became more of a language of the government and military and legal elements of the empire, and Greek or other common languages like Aramaic became more common in the Roman Empire. So when the Hebrew vowel points were added, part of the motivation for doing this is so that those reading the Hebrew Bible would properly know how to pronounce these words. In generations prior to the Babylonian captivity, it appears that the Hebrew people had a very strong grasp on that language and could have read any of the scrolls of the Scripture and been able to understand how to pronounce the words. But during the approximately 70-year period of the Babylonian captivity, it appears as if they lost this mastery of their language as they begin to speak the more common Aramaic. That's why later, between the two testaments, you see what's called the Aramaic Targums, which were essentially paraphrases of the Hebrew Bible. They translated the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic and put some commentary in there as well. Part of the reason for that was because so many of the Hebrew people did not have a mastery of the Hebrew language like they had had prior to the Babylonian captivity. And this only increased as time went on. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the dispersion of the Jews into these groups we talked about in our first lesson, pronunciation of words and the intonation that was used with some of these words, and even the different pronunciation of vowels and consonants began to change in some of these different groups. So part of the reason for the Masoretes adding the vowel points was so that someone reading the Hebrew Bible would understand how to properly pronounce those words. As it says in your lesson, this was done in order to better clarify and communicate the language in the Scriptures. Prior to that point, the vowel sounds would have been assumed without needing to be written. But again, as they lost the type of mastery that they had of their language prior to the Babylonian captivity, and even prior to the dispersion of the first century, there needed to be a more regulated way of ascertaining which vowels should be included in the written Hebrew. Throughout this series of classes, we're going to use what I call memory pegs, which are little tricks and tips that hopefully will help you better remember the letters of the Hebrew alphabet and some of the words we're going to memorize as well. A memory peg for remembering the Hebrew name for vowel points is based on its spelling and pronunciation. The Hebrew name for vowel points is nikud. So to remember this, you might think of the Hebrew consonants being naked, being bare of any ornamentation before the Hebrew vowel points were added. The Hebrew vowel points called nikud. So that kept the Hebrew language from being without the ornamentation, so to speak, without the dressing up of the vowels. Hebrew vowel points are usually placed below a letter, which is very unusual for those of us who are used to Western languages because we put our letters in a linear line. We have a consonant and then we have a vowel, and in our Western language the letters are next to one another in a linear sequence. But in the Hebrew language, the vowels can be placed in different places around the actual letter, not necessarily right beside it. And one of the most common places they're placed are beneath the letter. Sometimes they can also be found above the letter. When you look at the chart included with lesson number 3, you'll see examples of both of these.